Good evening and welcome to the second in our Landscape Urbanism lecture series. And tonight I'm very pleased to be able to introduce a lecture by Andreas Ruby. Andreas is a theorist, an architectural theorist and a curator. He has studied with both Paul Virilio and Bernard Tschumi, which is quite an impressive pedigree, I'm sure you'll agree. In 2001, he established an office for architectural communication with École Ruby, known as TextBuild, with whom he also wrote a book that's been kind of particularly significant to us, landscape urbanism, called Groundscapes, particularly because of its orientation towards architecture and its relationship toward the ground. Now, Andreas is speaking to us tonight on a topic, strategies of estrangement, where I understand he's going to be addressing, if not Brechtian approaches, then kind of approaching different art forms through Brecht as a strategy. So looking both at architecture and at other art forms, music, film, art, and others. So it promises to be a very interesting lecture. Now, after the lecture and some questions, there'll be an opportunity for us to go down to the AA bookshop, where Andreas will talk to us about his new publication from his and École Ruby's new publishing house, Ruby Press, and this new publication, this new title, it's called Urban Transformation. Okay, so that's after the lecture and after any questions that we have for Andreas. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Andreas Ruby.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm very delighted to be here, to be able to talk to you about probably my most obsessive, favorite fetish theory. But I'm not going to talk about the theory in itself, but I'm going to use little pieces of it as a filter, right? So I'm trying to make you see through that glasses, you could say, that would be today the estrangement theory of Bertolt Brecht. Now, Bertolt Brecht is a poet, as you might know, from the 20th century, one of the most important poets, and among his many achievements was not only that he wrote a lot of poems and plays, but he also introduced a new approach to how theater should work and how theater should enchant you as the audience. Brecht had this interesting critique of the old tradition of European theater that he called Aristotelian theater, which in his mind is based on a mode of empathy between you as the audience, as the viewer, and the hero or the heroine on the stage. That means we empathize with the emotions of the characters on the stage. When they suffer, we suffer. When they are happy, we are happy. And for Brecht, that type of identification was too easy. He said, it's not going to change anything if I'm just, empathizing with whatever happens on stage. It's much more interesting if the theater brings me into a position where I actually can reflect upon what's happening on the stage and basically also question whatever there is happening. Because only if I can question that, then maybe the theater or the play that I'm looking at can inform a different way of looking at the world, and then maybe, and this was his ultimate ambition, to change that world. Brecht was, a communist, and thought that it's not only necessary to change the social conditions that we live in, but also possible to do so. And for him, the V effect, the estrangement effect, was a possibility to do so, to actually instill a sensation of doubt in the audience, who starts to think, well, something that is happening on the stage now is not quite right. It's not quite in correspondence with how I usually see reality. So what is maybe an interesting truth, a hidden truth, in this kind of distortion of reality, and what happens if I then go out in the world again and look with this kind of information at the world again. And the difference or the distance between your expected vision of reality from the moment that before you came to the play to the moment when you step out of the theater and look at it again, the same scene, which now looks entirely different, that we could call an estrangement of reality. Now, the term estrangement really literally means what you think it does. To make things look strange, as something else than what they are. Or another type of translation was also used, defamiliarization. Brecht actually didn't invent that term. He took it on from the Russian formalists, like Viktor Shklovsky, for instance, who in the 1920s had defined the technique of estrangement as the possibility of something like art. Only, for instance, if in an artwork, a urinal that you put there can be seen as something else than a urinal, there would be a possibility of art. So the very notion of estrangement is the precondition for alternating versions of reality that we can articulate in different realms, such as art, theater, and so on. But for them, it was a formal argument, right? They wanted to be able to create this realm. This is annoying. They wanted to be able to create a special realm, such as art, in which we can reflect about our normal, everyday reality. Brecht went a step further. He really politically instrumentalized the technique of estrangement in the sense that he really wanted to confront you with a different version of reality that he intentionally distorted to make you think twice and actually then look again as the reality outside as a distortion of a possible other reality. Now, he defines this very simply and straightforwardly. He says to estrange an action or a character means first and foremost to sort of destabilize everything or to question everything that is familiar about it, rational, and understandable. So he confronts us with a paradox, such as, for instance, in this piece, which is an artwork from an Australian artist called Colin Morton. It's called Farns Haven, and you've been looking at it for some time now, and you may have been, you may have recognized that there's something behind the facade of 7-Eleven, something that you all know, that you have learned somehow during your architectural studies. And it's interesting, when I remember having seen this piece for the first time in a show in Melbourne, I could feel that thing that was so familiar, but I couldn't pinpoint it. It was on my tongue. The word was on my tongue, and I couldn't really spell it out until someone said, "Oh, that's a Farnsworth house, isn't it?" "Oh, yes." Crying out loud, it's a Farnsworth house. But it took me some time to actually really sort of wrap the wallpaper to really understand what we're looking at. And this is quite a beautiful moment, I think. And then obviously you understand the simple fact that this graphic is on this house changes the entire notion of the object. The fact that the context is a different one, a suburban parking lot, also changes the meaning of the object. So it's quite interesting to see how little you need to totally turn something upside down. That would be an interesting example of an estrangement technique. But it's basically all about a certain bewilderment about something that you had expected to happen in a different way. And I want to show you an example that it's a little movie, so we will have sound now. It's something that I've found on the internet and actually on the news, I think 2 years ago, in the summer of 2009, I think. No, 2007. There was this really interesting event of which we see a mini documentary, a 2-minute movie, which gives you the background.
A large and curious crowd gathered at the Tulsa County Courthouse in 1957. They came to watch the burial of a new Plymouth Belvedere. The two-tone gas guzzler was a time capsule and was going in the ground as Tulsa's way of celebrating Oklahoma's 50th anniversary. The car stays in its temporary grave until 2007, Oklahoma's centennial.
Oklahoma City had buried a time capsule, or was going to, and Tulsa at that time had more cars per capita than any city in the United States except Los Angeles. And automobiles were so popular, that was a classic thing to do to top Oklahoma City. Anything Tulsa tried to do, especially in those days, to top Oklahoma City, they would do.
Before burial, all sorts of memorabilia was placed in the Plymouth time capsule. The contents of a lady's purse, Tulsa maps, photographs, even a case of Schlitz beer. Oil and gasoline were also enclosed, just in case those things aren't around in the future. No one knows what condition that big Plymouth is in. Maybe it's as good as new, maybe it's rusting away. We'll find out in 2007, when the four-wheel time capsule was pulled from the ground.
Well, I think it's going to be in good condition. They took every precaution in the world, and they assured us that it was going to be in good shape. Whoever gets the car is going to have a pristine automobile, 50 years old, highly classic, and worth a lot more than the $2,000 that cars were worth then.
I'm sure it'll be a very big deal when they dig it up. Bring all the kids and grandkids.
Okay, so here we are, 2007. The car's about to be dug out of the ground. People are immensely excited and full of expectation. And this is important for the moment of estrangement. You need to have a certain expectation of what is going to come, which is then going to be disappointed. You know, I'm sort of spoiling the happy ending here. So they opened the ground. There's a concrete pit, perfectly manufactured concrete, you would think. And they opened the concrete pit, and it's clear that water has leaked in. The car is not going to be as pristine as a new car, highly classic, worth a lot more than it originally cost. However, the show must go on. There's an entire celebration planned. The car is being, there's a procession of the car to a big auditorium. But we can see in the face of the policeman here that he knows this is going to end bad. But there is no way. You have to go all the way. And here we are. We need sound again. The car is presented, unveiled as planned.
I'm excited. Yes. All eyes of the world are on Tulsa. See how great we are.
Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Belvedere.
Look at the white wall tires and stuff. You can still see where the people signed them in 1957. You've got a personality here. I mean, she's got a real personality that she went down, but she's not going to stay down.
I think it's incredible. I think it really shows the perseverance of Tulsa.
Absolutely incredible. It's been a complete delight to see Miss Belvedere. She needs to be kept exactly like she is.
They got to stop cleaning it. It ain't right, because that's the way it is. I mean, you either clean the whole thing or you don't clean anything. And I say don't clean anything.
I mean, it is as it is. And so many people are wanting to see her just as she is.
I don't see much of a car. It's too bad.
In a way, it is funny to hear these comments, but in a way, it's also very brave for me. I'm actually quite impressed by the reactions of the people that they say they should stop cleaning it. And this is a very important moment of estrangement. They were expecting to see a brand new car in the beginning, right? Then it turned out it was not that way, and they come to terms with the reality that went a different way than everybody had thought it would, and they accept the correction of their expectation, of their understanding of how a car should look like. And they say, actually, okay, this is different from what I thought, but I accept this as a primal reality. I'll take it as it is. It is as it is. We can't change it. And for me, it's quite a moving moment of how to manage your disappointment. A moment where your sense of reality turns out to be an illusion. And in Baudrillard's late work, there's a very interesting moment when he turns away from his earlier theory of simulation that he was so famous for, and where he says, no, something with the simulation is also wrong, because if a simulation is just credible enough, it really sheds away any former notion of reality. It becomes a reality in itself. And maybe one should use a different term for those kind of moments, no longer differentiating between wrong and right. And that term that he then was using, really very at the end of his career, was illusion, but not in the parochial sense that we would normally use it, but in the etymological meaning of the Latin word. And in illusion, there's the Latin verb illudere. That means, literally translated, to put something into play, right? It's basically when you watch little kids playing with each other. They do this all the time. They say, now you are my grandmother, and I'm the wolf. I'm going to have to eat you, but it's all right afterwards. You come to life again. And they play this. And for that time, it is real. So they put something into play. They put reality into play. Illudere. That's where this ludus is, the notion for play in Latin. And this is this wonderful moment where something that would normally have to be characterized as unreal becomes real because of your own decision, of your own will, where you say, now this is real for me. This is actually something I love in behaviors of kids. And this is something that these people do now when they say, stop cleaning it. It will never look the way it looked before. So maybe we can come to terms with this kind of car. And it's obviously, it's a beautiful moment because it's obviously in 2007, and you heard the movie before when the guy said they even put in some gasoline in it in case those things weren't around in the future. How prophetic. Yes, we're running out of oil. And the entire notion of the car that we have today is still so dependent on that notion of the car then, but here we are presented with the antiqueness of this entire concept, right? And we understand actually that we need to reorient ourselves and find different ways of understanding how we can be mobile in the world, because every new car that we produce now is actually conceptually in that kind of state of existence. And it's quite beautiful because in the lobby of that auditorium, somebody had thought it's great to put one classic car, a 1957 Plymouth there, just to show the resemblance, how close it comes. And this is the car inside, and that's the car outside. And the funny thing is, when I look at this car now, this looks more unreal to me than the car there, because I have already learned, to accept its groove and to dance to it. This now feels strange to me. And this is the ultimate interest of inverting familiar meanings. Now, by contrast, let's look at an example where this estrangement didn't work, right? It's an art project by a big car manufacturer, BMW, which is called Artcom. Since the 1960s, they have devoted, I think every couple of years or so, their fastest car to an art project. An artist, a famous artist of its time, was given the car and could do with it what he or she wanted, transform it into an artwork. The interesting thing is, when you look at the various cars that have been produced, like by Rauschenberg, by Alexander Calder, that was the first one historically, David Hockney, Jenny Holzer, Robert Lichtenstein, A.R. Pank, Frank Stella, Andy Warhol, you understand they all fail to transform the notion of the character of this object in a major way, because all they do is they mistake the car for a canvas, right? And they paint it, they decorate it. However, they don't treat the conceptual character of the object, of the car, as such, right? They just ignore it, that this is actually a car, and think, okay, I can, it's another type of canvas. And at some point, the people who ran this program understood that there's maybe something wrong with commissioning a painter to work with the transformation of a three-dimensional object. So maybe you should work with a sculptor. And that's what they did then in 2 years ago, when they had this car as their latest and most amazing piece of technology. This is the ultimate dream of the German BMW driver who feels politically incorrect for racing, but needs to do it because of its genetic code. I mean, I have the assumption that all BMW drivers have a certain DNA in common, which means that they can only drive on the overtaking lane. So never let any BMW drivers from Germany into Britain, because they will run down all the people because they don't make the difference of the lanes that are exchanged. Now this car actually runs on clean energy. It's an it's on H2 that it's powered. And this is a prototype. This actually works, and it can go 300 kilometers an hour. So it's like a Formula One car. So this is heaven for people in Bavaria. And so in a way, you could say it is the most successful, the most radical car that BMW has been able to produce. A race car that is ecologically correct, to reconcile the contradictions that existed heretofore. Now they commissioned this artist Olafur Eliasson, famous, sculptor or installation artist of our time, to do something with it. And this was actually the first moment in that entire program that an artist really thought about the embedded character of the object and how it was possible to actually challenge this and not be enslaved by the form of the car, because they understood very quickly, in order to do something with this car that was not just a footnote to this piece, which is in itself a marvelous piece of technology, right? Let's acknowledge that. It was not sufficient to just paint it or do something with it. You actually needed, they made a couple of studies. They understood that you actually need to dismantle the piece, to take away the cover. This is what they ended up with. So they took away the envelope and created a double-layered new envelope out of metal meshes in 2 layers, and sprayed the car for 3 days in an environment that was tempered to -9 degrees Celsius. So it froze. And it produced this kind of iced car look. But we can't really tell anymore that it's a car, right? We know that it's supposed to be a car, but we can't see it. So this is the moment where you actually start to have ideas that you would have never had with the other projects before. Because first of all, we think this is something quite ambiguous. It's both aggressive in terms of the climate. When you went into this space in the museum where it was presented, people were given actually covers and comforters to, sort of keep them somewhat warm. It's also aggressive in the sense that, for instance, it's so beautiful in a way, but like beautiful like a snake, that attracts you with its beauty, and then it bites. Actually, there was a little boy in San Francisco where this was shown who felt, without really knowing, so attracted to it that he started licking the ice. Now, you know what happens when you start licking ice, right? You get stuck to it. So they needed some warm water or a hairdryer to actually unfreeze him. And so it's kind of a vicious object, right? At the same time, it is quite fragile as an object, because of course, the minute you pull the plug, this piece, goes off air. I mean, it basically, the ice goes away. And interestingly enough, you could already sense this as a viewer if there was a group of 10 people or so. That was the maximum of people that was allowed at once in the space, but not primarily because of the size of the space, but because of the aggressive effect of our body heat acting upon the ice. You could actually stay there for 3 minutes inside the space, and you could actually see the ice diminishing. So this piece that looks aggressive in this sense, because of it's a hostile environment. If you were stuck in this space, you would die. You could feel this kind of aggression, but at the same time, you could also feel that you are aggressing this piece. So it was highly ambiguous. Then, Another thing that was beautiful is the idea that BMW's dream of the first ecologically correct race car was obviously turned down in a major way, because obviously if you present this project, you are burning a lot of energy, right? That's clear, because you have a fridge and the size of a room. So the entire assumption, the propaganda assumption of BMW was totally turned upside down. And it was like a questioning where we would think about, okay, how ecological is this car? You know, how ecological is the concept of individual transport? Is the electric car or the hydrogen car really solve the entire, dilemma? Is this the end of the line, or are there maybe other problems that we are not aware of? So instead of confirming the positive utopia of the car manufacturer, it created all kinds of doubts. And that's I think, the beauty of it. Even if you went very close, you could not really see what car it was. There's only one moment where I think the stick shift has the wheel you can see in the middle. There's this circle, which is part of the BMW logo. But basically the idea that this was a BMW car didn't play a role anymore. So the entire notion of maybe some kind of branding, as you saw before in the artworks, which all very subserviently made a piece of advertisement with an artistic surplus value. All that kind of branding is impossible with this piece. So I'm very sure, and actually I spoke in front of the series of the BMW design crew in Munich when this project was done, and I had to talk about this piece and try to explain them why I think it's a good project. So a lot of skeptical faces in the audience. But what came out in discussion afterwards is really that they thought about this piece made them think about and rethink their business in a major way that they had never done before. So it's a kind of a shock therapy, which produced a number of interesting results. Now, there you see in the back, you can see a car. So, right? So the entire car is still there, except the envelope, right? The metal body. So it is there. And it's this interesting discrepancy between knowing that it is there and not being able to see that keeps you so, in tension to have a look at it. Now, the master of this technique, and for my mind, the inventor of, or the guy that actually understood how the theatrical principle of Brecht's estrangement could be applied to the production and perception of space, for my mind, is a movie director, Stanley Kubrick, and he did this in a very beautiful way in a movie that you might know, which is, and here I'd like to have no sound for the beginning, because I want to show you something rather extraordinary, because Kubrick, being a genius filmmaker, uses the two layers of image and sound in very different ways, and you will understand how this produces an estrangement. So sound is really off, right, Nick? So okay, because otherwise we spoil the entire thing. Yeah. So these are the images that you see pretty early on in the movie, and oh God, it should be all right. The beautiful thing is that you see the technology of the space technology in a way that, with a perfection that did not exist before. This movie got all kinds of awards for the degree of realisticness of the simulation of the space technology. So it was mind-blowing to the people who saw this film when it was done in 1968. And with that kind of precision, it totally confirmed the understanding of the science fiction, of the idea of science fiction, and that existed until that time, which means that the dream of modernism will come true at one point. That means by the clever use of ingenious technology, we will be able to solve the problems of mankind, social problems, famine, you name it, right? And the film, if you know it, actually says the contrary, because it shows this mission into space which totally fails, and only one man of the space mission survives, because the technology is not as is not a slave to the will of humans, but actually emancipates itself from the will of humans, and the computer does whatever he wants. It's the story of hell. Now, in the soundtrack of this movie, you can actually understand or get a hint of this dooming disaster that waits for you in the later part of the movie, not by the image, but by the sound. And now we can have the sound as well. To speak as we hear it. Maybe we put it a little bit down. What you can discover as an effect is that the music, which is not 21st century music, it's 19th century music. Right? It's the Waltz of the Blue Danube by Johann Strauss. It is a music that is embedded in a totally different narrative of history, which is the moment where the bourgeois class became the ruling class of society and emancipated itself from the aristocracy, who had been the prime supporter of culture before. And now the bourgeois society takes on that role and becomes the actual player of the society. So it's a moment of ascending to power, the beginning of the capitalist society as we know it. And the juxtaposition of these two things together obviously produces a very strange effect. We see a celebration, a visual celebration of the future, but it's underlined with this musical celebration of a past, of the 19th century. So somewhat the direction of historical time that in a materialist understanding of history would always go from the past to the future, and the future would always be the good thing. Here is somewhat turned down. So the more we listen to this music, the more we dive into an understanding of the past. And what it also produces is that it changes the connotation of everything that we see in the movie. For instance, when I see this beautiful movement of the space shuttle as it lands into the landing terminal of the space station, I can't help thinking of the Viennese ballroom where like 300 couples of men and women dance in one swoosh movement with the white ballroom dresses and the black smoking of the men. And look at these. I can't help seeing a couple of people dancing together, right? You can see the synchronization of the space shuttle that rotates at the same speed as the shuttle itself. And the big shuttle, when it starts to turn in a minute, obviously looks like something that is very familiar here now, which is the Ferris wheel of the Prater in Vienna, which was then a piece of high technology. And it starts to dance itself. This is, to me, it's one of the most amazing moments of movie making in terms, or in relationship to architecture, because it really shows what goes along with the production of space. It's not only producing certain volumes, it's also producing certain meanings. And this is something that Kubrick shows a little bit later throughout the film in a very beautiful sequence of images. This would be the futuristic character of the space station. Here you see the most advanced kind of furniture. The space looks as really as from the next century. It was a kind of spatial quality that was unheard of, even in real architecture, so to speak, at the time. And then there's this beautiful moment here, which again is one of these perfect settings. But what I would like you to look at is the ceiling, the light ceiling. because that light ceiling comes back later at the very end of the movie when the space mission has totally failed in a radical catastrophe, and only one of the astronauts is actually surviving. And the situation he finds himself in is he lands on some kind of a planet, even though we never see the planet itself. We only see that he gets out of his capsule and steps into a space that looks like this. So you can see, I mean, first of all, obviously, a Rococo interior in the 21st century seems somewhat odd. How did it, how did it end up there? Oh, is he no longer than 21st century? Was the journey into future actually ending in a past that is also not the past that we know from 17th century, because we see that this version of Rococo seamlessly integrates lit grounds. You can also understand the beautiful inversion of a lit ceiling that we saw before that now becomes the ground. So it's clear that we have a total détournement, as you would say, in the situationist theory. And he needs to resolve this conflict. And he doesn't know how. And also, neither do we. It's it's one of the beauties of the film that it doesn't resolve this riddle. Kubrick doesn't tell, neither did he ever tell afterwards in interviews or so, how he intended this meaning to be solved. I think this is the actual moment that Brecht was interested in, where you have to resolve a paradox of something that obviously doesn't quite fit, but that provokes all kinds of questions in your mind, and where you also know you only yourself can find the answers to it. And obviously one of the answers would be to think, okay, obviously, maybe future can turn into something that we cannot predict, and that becomes something rather different. Now, what it also does, primarily does, is that we rethink the modes of our behavior. And to be a bit more spatial, I would like to show you, discuss a certain moment of this artwork that you might have seen here or have heard of, the Weather Project in the Tate by Olafur Eliasson, the artist that we saw before with the car project. Now, the beauty of this project, I think, was maybe something that the artist couldn't envision when he did it. Because his idea of how this work would work in terms of its public appropriation was this. This is one of the photographs that he did for press reasons before the opening of the actual project. Now, this is a project that had a huge public acclaim. It received 2 million visitors in a period of 6 months, from, I think, October until March the next year. So it was also the period with the most lousy weather in London. So it was obviously very tempting to go into a space that provided you with a big sun and with a kind of an atmosphere of warmness and to console you from this misery of overcast skies and humidity all around you. Now, but what is interesting in this image is that as radical as the work is, as traditional is the expectation of how people would perceive it. Because that type of behavior of a viewer in front of an artwork, even if it's that big, and be reminded that the entire ceiling of the project was mirrored. So they built only the lower half of the sun, so to speak. The upper half was mirrored, as was the entire ground in the ceiling. So it felt even larger. It felt like more Gothic cathedral-like. So that type of behavior of looking at things like this is obviously very reminiscent of this type of behavior, which comes from the Romantic painting, where for the first time in the history of painting, the landscape was no longer shown alone, but actually with a subject that perceives it. So which basically said the landscape doesn't exist unless there's someone to look at it. And hence we become aware of our own role in this production of landscape, this aesthetic production of landscape. We understand by not only looking at a landscape, but by looking at somebody looking at a landscape, that we do this all the time, and that the world doesn't exist unless there's a relationship between the world and us as people. Now, let's go back to this project, because this is actually what happened. people didn't look at this in this sublime, way of early 19th century. They took the world literally. They did what Baudrillard meant with the concept of illusion. They accepted the play. It was an invitation to play, and they accepted it. Say, okay, if you are a sun in the middle of lousy weather London, I'm going to understand this concrete floor as a beach. And people lay down. Now, this is extraordinary because you know that this is a museum. And we have all kind of behavioral protocols in our mind that have been instilled during our education, where our mom and dad said, you don't lie down in a museum. It's not the way to behave, because otherwise I'm going to throw you out and you cannot see all these beautiful paintings. Here people overstep this kind of behavioral protocol seamlessly. They understood, or basically it's the proof that the work, the project here was able to transcend the character of the museum. It was able to transform this museum into something else, into something that we would not think is a museum. I mean, this is sublime in a 21st century sense of way, not in a William Burke way. It is really interestingly to see how people really take on the scale of this space. And here I would like to make a comparison with a piece of music that I want to play you, to simply give an understanding of how I understand the effect of this piece. Let's hear to this piece of music now from the other source. This is a cover version of a very famous 60s pop song, and you should recognize it even though it's highly estranged. Hands up, who knows it? It's, say it? Satisfaction, exactly. But let's listen to it a bit more. Isn't this beautiful? The most iconographic song of the student revolution and of the uproar of the 1960s rebel generation is turned into a hedonist soundtrack where I'm imagining myself lying on the beach of Santa Monica and thinking about whether I get up to get my next mojito or I continue to burn in the sun. This is Gary McFarlane, a record called Latin Lounge. It's highly recommendable. He does this with a couple of songs, also with Beatles. And obviously you understand that the entire ideology of that song is totally turned upside down. And that song was done in the 70s, this cover version. And this is a moment that I'm interested in this project by Eliasson, because you can understand that people even take the mirrored ceiling as a new media of collectivity. They understand, okay, we can see ourselves. That also means we can perform towards the entire group. And we can make configurations. You can see the peace sign there. But there was a lot more going on during that. There's a beautiful article in The Guardian. You can find it on the web by one of the museum attendants of the new Tate, the Tate Modern. And he was describing all the kind of spontaneous performances that took place in the museum that were not staged, that really simply by people who were excited and sort of inspired to use this space as a space of their own performance. So for instance, one project in it, I would call them projects because they're all really beautiful ones, there was an anti-Bush demonstration. George Bush was then here to have tea with Tony Blair, and some people objected to that and made a phrase here that said like Bush go home, only with their bodies, right? And using these configurations. There was an esoteric dance group that rehearsed one of their pieces there, and two people made an actual picnic. They went here with a full-size picnic, everything in the basket and cheese and bacon and so on, and had the picnic there. And obviously it was beautiful. And my favorite piece is one guy came with an inflatable canoe, inflated it, put it on the ground, set himself inside, and started canoeing towards the sun. And obviously what this produces is a second-degree reality, because obviously the other people that are there just as visitors think twice. What is this supposed to say? Are these like little performances that have been staged by the artist? You know, this mean guy, he doesn't tell us. Or are these just some wackos? And obviously it could not be resolved no more than the riddle at the end of the Kubrick movie before. So it's a layering of reality, and you have to decide yourself what is real for yourself. But what it certainly does is that you understand that it would be perfectly possible to use a museum space in an utterly different way than the way that we've been trained culturally by our education, which is to go silently from painting to painting, look at it in a learned way, read the message that is next to it, and then go on. Now, what is important to keep in mind here is, I mean, this obviously looks like Miami to me, you know, like Miami in London. What's important is that the principle of transformation in this work by alienation, as in all of the other estrangement examples that I'm trying to discuss with you here, is that it's no longer part of the Duchamp effect. The Duchamp effect is, as you will know, it could be summarized by the slightly banal line that everything that you put in a museum nowadays instantly turns into an artwork, no matter what it is. Right? The authority of the museum is such that it says, I'm the temple that says what is art and what is not. So whatever is in here is art, whatever is out is not. Simple principle of reality. And Duchamp was the first to really prove how this worked in taking a prefabricated industrial object, putting it into a museum, and people were appalled and actually thought, well, this guy is a maniac. I mean, how can he do such a thing? It's not an artwork. But as it's in a museum, we have to look at it as such. Right? They were forced to look at something that they thought is a container of excrements. And obviously, it took them some time to understand that that there's a very slight and important shift by Duchamp, that he doesn't put it as in the toilet, but he puts the surface that hits the wall in the toilet to the socle, which then produces this utterly different shape. So there is an estrangement as well here, but it's an estrangement of the object, right? So we look at the pissoir no longer as a pissoir, a urinal, but as something else. And we still have to resolve what this something else could be. But what it does not, and this is actually what you could see in the example of a liaison, is it does not estrange or transform the space around. Duchamp actually really needs the space to stay what it is, which is the museum, because he needs the authority of the museum to say that this is art. So there's a very clear separation as to the boundaries of transformation. They are, the estrangement is hitting upon the object and not on the space. A totally different example, the total opposite, would be something we could call the Brotas effect. No, I mean, it's not in the literature. I just invent this for us here. It's a work by Marcel Brotas, a Belgian artist from the 70s, and this is a very beautiful installation called Jardin d'Hiver, Winter Garden. It was performed, I'm compelled to say, but it was installed in the Palais des Beaux-Arts in 1974. And what is the important difference in this work? It is that we can no longer see clearly the boundary between the figure and the ground. So what is the object and what is the space around? The so-called neutral museum space, right? That all curators are so mad about and that they accuse architects of not providing. Here, Brotas very consciously blurred those boundaries by putting the same elements, the little palm trees and the chairs, that could stem from a botanic museum or a winter garden, a palm house. Those that he put in the center of the space, which could be regarded as the thing, as the art project. He also puts them to the boundary of the space, around. So we don't really know where does the artwork stop and where does the actual space, of presentation begin. And then he continues to put these illustrations. they're reprints of illustrations from botanical and zoological encyclopedia from the 19th century, puts them on the wall, and also in the glass cases along the wall. And what it produces is a very beautiful poetic moment. I saw this project later in a different space, and it produced something that rarely happens to me. It's really that I went into the space knowing it's a museum, and for a fraction of a second, I forgot that I'm in a museum, because I started to look at these elephants there and had the feeling, you know, I looked at them as if I was looking at them in a natural history museum and no longer as in an art museum. So I looked at them in a naive way. I started to get interested in, you know, oh, there's the baby elephant, how cute. So this is probably a family. So where was this? Or maybe in Congo, you never know. He was a Belgian guy, so maybe, you know, Congo was a... So you get on a whole different train of thought until the moment where, like a shock wave, it dawns upon you, no, I'm not supposed to look at this project in this banal way. This is not colonial history. This is an art project. And you think, okay, I'm supposed to think about representation, you know, Adorno, and you think, okay, I've been caught. You know, the piece led me, it seduced me, it led me into a direction that no museum normally could have led me, no art museum. And this is really the moment where the project succeeds in transforming the typological notion of the space from a museum space into, for instance, that's the way I perceived it, a space in a museum for natural history, as you can find them as well. And they are also very beautiful museums, I think. This is the moment that I'm interested in terms of the estrangement, that we find that by injecting an object into a space, you can actually redefine the character of everything around this object. Not so much this thing. It still is a bottle, but something around will change dramatically. Look at this one. This is a museum again, and we can see how it actually works with the classical identity of the museum. This is a project by a Belgian architecture group called 51N4E. The geographical coordinates of the city of Brussels, in case you wondered what the name means. 51 north, 4 east. And it was an existing museum that was not very interesting as an architectural piece, and they were given the job of an interior refurbishment. This is how it looked before, and it's very clear to see that we have all the attributes of a mediocre museum space, right? We have the textile wall that probably accumulates dust, has accumulated dust over decades. That makes the air very, very bad. I can see the air conditioning there, which is probably very old, and it makes me headaches simply from looking at it. So it's probably a space where I would start to yawn after 10 minutes, which is my usual reflex in museums. No matter how important and interesting the artwork is, simply the dullness of the museum architecture makes me feel that way. And I regret this, because I have to leave again. But luckily, there are cafeteria now. And here you have another space which looks simply the same way. And what do we see? We see people that are standing in front of paintings, but not looking at these paintings. Where do they look at? They look at the guidebooks they brought from home or bought in the museum shop, or they look to the little label captions. But they don't do the thing they could actually do only in the museum, which is looking at the bloody original, right? They never have that luxury. So they don't, apparently the scenography of perception that is articulated by the museum space experience is not capable of guiding them toward the thing itself. The precious moment of actually seeing a Dürer, of actually seeing a Cranach, or an Alder van Eyck, Jan van Eyck, as in this case, because this is a very important museum, as it has one of the biggest treasures of Renaissance painting of the Belgian art history. Now, this is the transformation of this is the project by 51N4E, and you can see a lot has changed. What you cannot really see is, or what we can see is they have taken on the narrative of the white cube, right, as we can see. So they partly confirm it, and then partly disrupt it. First of all, by something that they also make, by over-affirming, you could say, right, the white cube ideology, because they also make the ground white. But what material is it? You can not really see it only here in the lower corner. You can see these grid-like textures. This is actually, these are Bisatzer tiles. It's a material that you use in bathroom design, right? It's a glass mosaic, So it's waterproof material, which is not necessary to have in a museum because people make sure that there's no water, right? Because it's harmful for the paintings. So it's obviously a decontextualized material. It's a material that evokes a lot of associations, atmospheric associations to a bathroom, because this is where it comes from. In addition, with a thick red plush carpet that is placed upon it. I actually remember my parents in their bathroom had such a carpet. Not as big as this, because we had a smaller bathroom. But it still had the same kind of effect, this sensorial effect that it produced was whenever you would go into a space like this, and I had the same effect when I entered this space, you want to take your shoes off. Because you think, first of all, you make traces of dirt with your shoes, and second of all, it would be so nice to touch with your skin, the red plush carpet to sink in and have this kind of noise that is absorbed in it. So there's this entire story of seduction that a bathroom, does to get undressed, right? I mean, this is the ultimate story. So, and I not that I would get totally naked, but taking off your jacket is already something you can feel as an automated reflex that simply is there's a button pushed in your unconscious simply by this kind of setup. Now, what this produces is really, and a lot of art people hate this project to death, right? I mean, curators say these guys are nuts, and it's impossible, it's a blasphemy, as if art was a religious thing. They don't understand that it is actually very successful in guiding your attention to the paintings, because they are the one thing that is now alien in the space, the one thing that you would not expect in this space. So you look towards it, and maybe you see that painting that you've seen times and times again before if you were local to that museum with totally new eyes. Sometimes they made these kind of Petersburg hangings with paintings that are not so strong as others, but regrouping them, making them stronger. And then there's this moment where they put the walls black to accommodate more the tone of color in the paintings. These are 19th century paintings with this typical brownish background color. And what it produces is, as the ground always stays white, it produces such a sharp contrast of dark and light that it almost, it's almost painful to your retina. So you choose, as a matter of consolation to your eyes, to look at the paintings. Well done. See that here? It's again, in the image, it's almost painful. It's as if you were skiing, and you know this moment when you don't have your sunglasses, and you're so blasted away by this gigantic whiteness that comes from the ground. It's a similar effect. So the sky would always be darker, blue or overcast, but the snowy ground would be totally throwing you away. And they use this kind of estrangement technique not only in aesthetic terms, but also in programmatic and typological terms. For instance, here you have the feeling, oh, I took the wrong door. I ended up in the storage of the artworks. But it's called public archive. So that means you're meant to see that artworks not only exist in the ethereal ideality of the white cube, but also in a very profane reality of being hung in a magazine as in the archive. And sometimes you can look at them, sometimes you can't even look at them, and you feel totally, I want my money back. It's impossible. And then there are these very strange objects that you can't really figure out what they are. Is this a bench? No, not really. Is this an auditorium? Well, almost. It's kind of, but it has the height of a table. So you can't really pinpoint the identity of this piece, but you can, however, find ways of using this thing, as for instance these people do. And you understand that because the object enables this kind of usage, it enables also different ways of looking at an artwork. Because maybe I feel more comfortable being seated like this and looking at, I think, a Jackson Pollock, than if I had to stand in front of it, and get pain in my knees. And it also obviously enables more casual forms of appropriation than maybe a totally, intimidating museum space. This is the moment where we can see the surplus value of Brecht's understanding of the of the estrangement theory that it enables you to find different ways of acting in the world, as opposed to simply looking different at the world. And this is the ultimate value of this theory for me when we use it as a filter of, as a glass, a kind of glasses, to look at architecture. That, for instance, is interesting, and we use for this type of operation something that is kind of a further evolution of Tschumi's concept of cross-programming, which you probably know from the 70s, where he says, what happens to the Sixtinian Chapel if you stage a boxing fight in it? What happens to the game of football if you perform it on an ice skating rink, right? So obviously there's a discordance between the action and the space that is supposed to host that kind of action, if it's not exactly made for one each other. Obviously, what happens is if you play football on an ice skating rink, is you have to reinvent the game of football quite clearly, right? The space dictates a redefinition of the rules, and it's probably very interesting. It would be cool to see David Beckham ice skating with a football. Now, this, for instance, and in parallel to this notion of cross-programming, we could understand this as an operation of cross-atmosphering. The example before would, for instance, use the atmosphere of a bathroom through the tiles, the material evocations of the tiles and the carpet. So there's a bathroom atmosphere that is kind of sort of put over the programmatic identity of a museum, and something similar happens in this thing, where we have the evocation of a white cube museum space. However, in terms of program, this is a fair stand. And it's interesting because it's white all over the place, even the furniture. So it produces a highly different situation from a normal fair stand setup, which is like this, meaning everybody being so concerned about expressing their uniqueness, because obviously, the unique selling proposition forces you to be different than everybody else, ending up in a situation where everybody looks the same, right? I mean, you can't remember one single fair stand because they all are so eccentric and over the top that you say, I want to get out of here. And then you end up at this space and say, oh, wow, gonna stay 2 minutes here. And the interesting thing is, even though it doesn't look as a fair stand, it works as a fair stand, because we did some photographs and looked at the space, how it is actually used, and there's one beautiful moment that you cannot see in the beautiful photographs that are used to represent the project in publications, because obviously for architectural photographers, the presence of human must incur some dangerous intoxication that needs to be avoided at any price, even at a large price of totally not getting the point of the project, which in this case was this. You can see the scale of the furniture doesn't quite fit. Something you don't see when you look at this, right? It looks perfect, right? It looks absolutely perfect. They did something very interesting with the CI of this company, which produces high-quality measuring devices, was based on a DIN format, the Deutsche Industrienorm, the German industrial norm that produced A4, A3, and so on. And they understood that all their elements of their CI were really sort of fixed to this kind of obsession of a norm that is applicable to everything. So they said, okay, what is a fair stand other than a three-dimensional business card? It's okay, we're going to apply the DIN system as well. And they did. So all the surfaces here are perfectly with a golden section, and they fit in, you can say these panels on the wall, there are A0 and so on. Until they came, it worked until the table, until they came to the question of the chairs. It turned out that the human butt, in average, is something between A2 and A3. So they had the choice to make chairs that are either too large or too small. And they found it most inspiring to make them too small, as we have been seeing here. Now, the interesting thing is that even though being confronted with the paradox of a children's room for themselves, the managers use the space as if it was a normal fair stand. You can see, so they really make business deals here, and the chairs are also strong enough to support heavy Bavarian managers with their 90 kilograms point load. And however, you can see, I mean, this is almost tati, right? I mean, this is almost playtime. It's a moment that is just a feast to the eye. I actually did this photograph, and I could sense in the moment that I did it that the guy there with this slightly too reddish skin tone, the air conditioning in Fairsense is also very bad, understands that he's being photographed here, and he understands something is wrong, right? So my presence photographing him is like the person in the Caspar David Friedrich painting and the Romantic painting before that makes me aware of, oh, that's interesting. There's a person inside the painting looking at the landscape. So obviously, maybe it makes sense to look at the landscape. And maybe I understand, maybe the landscape is an object of perception that is worthy of our attention. So I'm the kind of thing that makes him understand that this is a setup, right? But still the setup is workable. It's not an absurd situation to the point that it produces a dysfunctionality of the space. It just puts this thing into play. And if you ever have spent time on a fair, you know how dull it is to stay there more than 30 minutes. So I think this is actually a very nice gesture towards the people that have to spend days there. And there's one beautiful moment that you also can't see, and I think we still need to invent a tactile representation of architecture in magazines, because here, for instance, you think these pieces of furniture, they look hard, right? They look hard because of their geometry supposes that they're totally stiff. And actually, they're not. They're made of foam. And it produces a sensation of estrangement that you can actually feel in your own system, and it's a beautiful moment. So it's nothing theoretical at all. It is absolutely perceivable. So what happens is if you lower your behind, so to speak, as you approach, the landing terminal of your seat, you predict a hard landing because you think that this is very stiff. And what happens is, as a countermeasure, you flex your bottom muscles in anticipation of this point of contact. As you, however, touch base, you sink in it in a very nice and comfortable material. You sink about 3 or 4 centimeters in. And it's a beautiful moment because it totally corrects your predicted estimation of this material. So it looks hard, but it's soft. And then obviously is a beautiful moment of telling you, hey, I was wrong. How nice that I was wrong, because it's so much nicer. And there is the power, one of the powers of this kind of strategy for me is the possibility of a different kind of critique of reality. Not a critique in the classical sense where you frontally critique something, like, for instance, what in the Frankfurt School is called the ideologie critique, the ideology critique, where you say the capitalist system is bad and it needs to be abolished, right? We know that, right? But we haven't managed to do so yet. Even with the crisis, it still continues to live. Like a dragon that grows new heads, the more you cut them off. However, that type of non-frontal critique would be a possibility of making a reality implode in itself and by the accumulation of inbuilt contradictions. Now, to understand what this is all about, I have to show you a little excerpt of one of my most favorite movies of all times after 2001. This is the top. But then there's a lot of contenders. This one is a still from Ghost Dog, a movie by Jim Jarmusch. What you need to know to understand this section that I'm going to play you in a second is that this guy is one of the directors of a Brooklyn-based mafia gang. And he has a talk with one of his lower employees, who is a middleman to a contract killer that they work with, who is played by Forrest Whitaker. And this introduces the theme of this movie, which is to accumulate as many contradictions as possible and see how they fight each other, right? Because it's very clearly based on the racist agenda of the self-understanding of the Brooklyn Mafia. They would never work with a black guy as a contract killer because they despise every race, beyond the Italian one. I mean, which for them is a race. And So they're not only like xenophobic, they're racist, and they're also they're also homophobic. So I mean, gay persons have also no right of existence. And instead of critiquing these kind of notions in a frontal way, Jarmusch chooses to let them do the work and dismantle themselves. And this is a beautiful way because, for instance, like also this person, for instance, you would understand later if you see the whole movie, even though if he always has homophobic slang in his words, is actually secretly gay. Right? This is impossible in this kind of world. It's the biggest kind of self-impotence that they could inflict on themselves. And there's one beautiful moment where he also conveys and reveals that he's actually a fan of black music, gangster rapper type of music. Normally, in the normal protocol of his identity and his profile, that would be impossible. And that's why Jarmusch puts these things together and lets him reveal that he actually likes it. And this is shown in this sequence as they ask about the identity of who is this guy, because they want to trace him down because they have thought twice about a murder that they have commissioned him to do, which was a murder of one of their own gang. And the next morning, the boss said, no, I didn't want him to be killed. Oh, now he's dead. What are we going to do? Well, we killed the killer. Okay, where is he? Let's track him down. And this is the moment where they think, oh, how can we get to this guy? We need sound now again from the computer. Oh, I'm sorry. That was my mistake. I need to please put the sound down for a moment. I need to replug. This is highly complicated. And now the sound up, please.
Handsome Frank was one of us. So now we're going to peel this nigger's cap back.
Hear the racist terminology, right?
Better him than you, right, Louis? Now what the fuck is his name?
Ghost Dog.
What?
Ghost Dog.
Ghost Dog?
He said Ghost Dog.
Yeah, he calls himself Ghost Dog. I don't know, a lot of these black guys today, these gangster type guys, they all got names like that they make up for themselves.
Is that true?
Sure. He means like the rappers. You know, the rappers, they all got names like that. Snoop Doggy Dogg, Ice Cube, Q-Tip, Method Man. My favorite was always Flavor Flav from Public Enemy. He got the funky, fresh, fly flavor. Live lyrics from the bank of reality. I kick the flies, dope, maneuver technicality. Do a dope track. I love that guy.
I don't know anything about that.
Isn't this beautiful? I mean, he's not aware of the way in which he contradicts the entire ideological narrative that he's supposed to perform as a true and genuine mafia gangster type of guy. And he completely mistakes the type of identities that he should be performing himself and that he should be up against. And that's a wonderful moment that we could have seen in the architectural projects before too, where a certain ideology, for instance, the understanding of what is a museum, implodes in itself by the accumulation of the inbuilt contradictions, if I can put it this way. Now, I mean, back to architecture. How would you do this in even a little residential project? Another type of project by 51N4E, the guys with the museum and the red carpet. They had the commission of converting an old farm yard, an old farm, a peasant's farm, into a residence. And the people said, okay, we take the stable and turn it into a kitchen. And we want it to be a very luxurious kitchen, a kind of Bulthaub kitchen, that costs amazing amounts of money. Now, the architects understood very early on, if you do that with the type of budget you have, we can only put this bit of the space into this luxurious, state-of-the-arts, top business class condition, and the rest we will have to leave as is, as the stable. Are you fine with it? I said, okay, let's go for it. And what it does is that it produces this type of lifestyle kitchen and dismantles it at the same time, because this kind of Carrara marble wall that you see is actually not a thick Carrara marble, but it's very thinly cut Carrara marble, maybe a couple of millimeters, that are glued on a honeycomb aluminum sliding door that can be slit away to give you to this kind of very raw Lacaton-Vassal kind of space as is, right? And it's so beautiful to see how these two different notions of space completely cross-define each other. That means the chic minimalist space sort of transfers some of its chicness to the stable, which becomes almost a designed loft space, right? Even though it's just being taken as is. And conversely, the stable in all its untouchedness transfers some of its authentic roughness to this over-aestheticized kitchen space. I think that's kind of an interesting kind of dialogue. You know, it's like the guy that raps, right? The kitchen that flirts with its own contradiction. You know, this is the kitchen that, you know, makes the rap now, as we have seen before. The interesting thing is that they did this also with the outdoor spaces. This is the farm that I'm talking about, and there was this one space in the kitchen itself, where in the courtyard, that was empty. It was the former dunghill. And obviously there's no dunghill anymore, but the people wanted to have a swimming pool. But they wanted, the clients, but originally they wanted it to have it in, you know, way back behind the throughway in the garden, because in the garden this is where you put your swimming pool, isn't it? And the architect said, well, you're going to end up with this space totally empty. Wouldn't it be much more interesting to put a swimming pool in that courtyard? So okay, go for it. They took then a regular off-the-shelf prefab pool, put it in here, but put it in not flush with the ground, as you can see, but extruded it slightly, added this seating step to it, coated it black, and produced, obviously, the first iconoclasm. Because as we know, the swimming pool has to be blue. I don't know why that is, but all the swimming pools that I know are blue, right? Have you ever noticed? And I'm beginning to think that is maybe because the blue makes a very good contrast to the red. And if, you know, judging from the many movies with dead bodies falling into swimming pools and, you know, reaching out their blood, it is a very picturesque moment. And maybe that, you know, has been just taken over by even non-murder interested domestic disciples. It produces something else. The blue also gives you always total control, visual control about the entire depth of the water. You can see if there's something. You can see if there's a dead body, right? Here you could not. As it is black, it produces this strange uncanniness of, let's say, of going to swim in a lake. As a kid, I always was afraid of going into the lake because I was never sure, but maybe there's an old motorbike there that somebody let fall in, and I'm going to hurt my toes, and this is, I rather don't go in. This is only 1.50 meters or so deep. So, and you also know that, right? But the knowing doesn't help you to get your anxiety behind that is produced by the visual setup. It's a fairly interesting kind of staging. And it will then also produce a very different way of looking at this piece, because what it also produces is that the husband is a lawyer who receives his clients somewhere in this complex, has an office, and he's aquaphobic. He can't stand water. The person who wanted the pool was his wife, who was a former high-performance swimmer. Great couple, isn't it? And so she loves to swim, every day in the morning. Same sort of time when the clients of her husband lawyer come around. They have to cross his courtyard to get to his office, and are obviously faced with a scene that they are not aware. I'm not sure whether they're supposed to see this, or not, because it has the look and feel of a private scene. But she's very comfortable with it, and the visitors maybe not. It sort of creates an interesting setup. Now there's another example I want to show you how that kind of estrangement can play between a new building and old building. This is a rather interesting office building in the south of Germany. Allman Sattler Wapner are the architects. And what this building does is it makes a very paradox gesture. These buildings are entirely coated in stainless steel because it's an office building for an association of metal producing factories in southern Germany. So their material is used to identify the complex materially. However, as we can see, the shape of the buildings is not a usual office building, but it's a building type that tries to mimic the 19th century residential buildings that stand in that kind of context. So this is the way how the architects try to resolve the paradox of having to build an office building in a residential complex. And what happens here is something I would like again to paraphrase with a piece of music by a London-based DJ and musician called Nitin Sawhney. And he has an Indian background, so his parents are from India, but he was born here. But in his music, which is really amazing, he always juggles around with these two identities of his own biography, the Indian native context that he understood as a foreign thing because he needed to go there first, and as a tourist, and his London kind of context. And he produced a piece that's called Voices, in which he has a very interesting setup staged, and we're going to hear this in a second, but I will show you how it works. It's 4 pieces, full movements, so to speak, and the way that they're dramatized is very conscious. The first set is a piece of traditional Indian chanting of a man and a woman doing this very percussive sound that the chant that you have maybe heard. The second movement is an electronic drums performing a drum and bass piece. The third one is the Indian singers coming into play again and emulating the drum and bass sound together with traditional Indian percussive instruments like bongos and congas and tablas. And the fourth movement then is the drum and bass coming in and playing together with the Indian chant. So it's a mutual kind of cross-information of traditional and hyper-modern pieces. So we can have the sound now. Louder, please. This is the drum bass piece. These are voices. And now all together. So what you see is, obviously, this is the metal surface of the building itself. It's quite amazing as an interpretation of what stainless steel can be, because it's hyper thin, and it feels like Terminator 2, like the bloody office building dissolving into a liquid thing. Now, what they did obviously is this is Ilka, my partner, Ilka Ruby, with whom I work all the time together, and also did this book. Now, what they do with this kind of technique is resolving the technique of a program mass that was too large to fit in one of the traditional typologies of these residential buildings around. So it would have been like acontextual to put a huge building that just fits the program mass of the office building in one mass, right? So they split the mass up into these three idealized traditional houses, as you can see, and make it work in this way. The funny thing is, however, that obviously as they make, in terms of volume of the buildings, a conciliatory gesture towards the traditional character of the neighborhood, and also the mental setup of these people who live there. The more you get to southern Germany, the more backward it gets. On the other side, they make an estrangement by using this highly dematerialized metal, which is like a car engineering material. And interestingly enough, southern Germany is the place where almost all of the German cars are being produced, aside from Volkswagen, which is in the north. So this is the Mercedes-Benz Porsche country, right? So and the architects actually wanted to address the split in the mental agendas of people there, which are on one hand extremely traditional in terms of how like a city should look, for instance, and how they identify themselves in terms of cultural agendas, and should we have foreigners here or not? And on the other hand, they're totally technophile because they all work in the car industry. So they are unable to absorb the notion of progress that they are confronted with in their working lives, in their private lives. And this kind of schizophrenia is addressed in this project. Interesting to see is that you could have done that also the other way, as these guys in Slovenia, Sada Vuga, who had to make a residential building in a residential context. However, they had to put again a program mass that didn't fit in any kind of scale category of this type of neighborhood. However, they chose to really stage the scale conflict, not resolve the scale problem by cutting up the volume of the building, but really sort of blasting inside. And on top of that, what do? If I hadn't told you that this is a residential building of 12 condominiums, what would you think this is? Just in terms of guessing from the look of the building. Huh? Yes, exactly. I mean, that's exactly what you would think, right? And it combines the catalog of uglinesses that you could have found in the 80s office architecture in a very, very virtuoso way, because this is a very conscious choice of making it look that way. And it produces, so they instead of reconciliating the conflict between program and mass, they actually choose to exacerbate that kind of conflict. And what it does, obviously, is it changes the character of this neighborhood. It's no longer clear, is this just a residential context? And also the question of this hybridity of this residential context in itself, which has these huge garden allotments, which is quite an interesting situation. So the garden is obviously being changed and transformed by the wannabe office building, but in retrospect also, I mean in the other direction also, the garden changes this allure of this wannabe office building and makes something that makes something to it that would not be if the context would be neutral. Now I don't know if we have to slowly come to an end, or I have more material. You have to tell whether you're still up for it or not. Yeah. Like 10 minutes? Yeah. 5 minutes? 10 minutes is okay? Good. Okay, let's try if we can get a ride to it. For instance, the same happens with this. You were remembering when I spoke before with the bottle that stays a bottle, but manages to transform the entire space around. This is an art project by Monica Bonvicini, who's an Italian artist, who made this thing which is a toilet in terms of program. And the cool thing about it is that you can actually use it as a toilet if you dare doing so. Now, why would this be a challenge? Because you can see it's probably made of glass or some mirror material, you think. But you cannot see inside. It's impossible to see inside. Actually, people you can see here in the area that they glue their noses to the facade to actually test that it's really impossible to see inside before they go into the toilet, right? And so they're very pacified when they go inside and shocked when they close the door, because it's absolutely transparent from inside to the outside. Now, the fact that you know that from the outside it's impossible to see inside doesn't help you when you actually have to come to terms with undressing in front of a public. That's the way you perceive it. Again, this is this beautiful split between what you know and what you experience. And what you experience is much more powerful than what you know. Forget knowledge. This is experience. What do? I mean, some people go out very quickly after they have come in, and some people who really were very happy to find a toilet This was the Art Basel, and I was wandering endlessly through gallery stands and in search of a toilet. So I, being very happy to have found a toilet, eventually used it. And it was a major challenge, as you can see here. But I did it. Skip this. But this is ultimately why I think working with a Brechtian agenda of estrangement can be meaningful to architects who are interested in more than producing objects. As this happens in the context of a landscape architecture, it is clear that there is an interest in an architecture that produces interventions of material character, of sculptural, of object character, that transcend the perimeter of that intervention, that actually stretch beyond, that radiate out into space, and that manage to transform that type of space. And this project, for instance, in Barcelona, for instance, would be an example of this. This is a project from the 80s, the worst postmodern time, Mansilla and Tugnon, a really beautiful project, I think. It's a museum in a very historical context. They made this huge glass facade, and the upper part of it is slightly inclined towards us to make to provide us with a far view of the sea. Actually, if you look closer, you can sort of divinate, divine the sea of Barcelona, the beach of Barcelona. It's no longer that well visible nowadays because sometime later after that project, another building that was very white was built just behind it, which is Richard Meyer's Museum of Contemporary Art. So you see the perfectly neutral isn't necessarily neutral at all. However, people who use this space are, for instance, these people. Normally it's a space of a passage. People go through to go to Richard Meyer, right? Not understanding that there's a museum actually behind this facade as well. Now these girls and boys are there all the time. Whenever I'm in Barcelona, I go to this space. So just if you want to do that too, it's at the Macba neighborhood. And you can see them always performing their MTV choreographies there. And the beautiful thing is that they haven't read Foucault, and they don't worry about transparency and self-control and public space and all these kind of things. They just need a mirror, right? They can afford a ballet room, so they use this one instead. I think this is an amazing moment where you can see how things that you put into space inform other things that you cannot do, right? You can't design people dancing, but you can design conditions that inspire people to dance in public space. And I think that's quite an interesting mission for architecture. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Andreas, for that. I'm going to actually start. We have probably about 10-15 minutes for questions, but just something, a kind of question and a comment I'd like to kind of direct you is that the more you went through those examples, the more I was struck by the fact that so many of them were actually about things that we don't hear very much about in architectural discourse or practice presently, in that they're about contradiction, juxtaposition, they're about kind of frictions and difficulties. And, my kind of own feeling about architecture at the moment, so much of it is kind of obsessively concerned with everything being smooth. Somewhere along the line there's this adoption of supposedly Deleuze-Guattarian smooth space, which seems to me like to make any kind of alienation effect absolutely impossible. Mm-hmm. And when I read particular uses of smooth space such as that, I kind of see them as ways of, integrating the subject into space in this very kind of smooth, non-questioning fashion. So my question is, with the examples you're looking at, when there's these kind of tensions and contradictions and frictions within them, is there, or should there be, perhaps a kind of larger politics to any of this, going back to Brecht originally, or do you think it's purely kind of, or just should be limited to the actual moment of being in that space and experiencing it differently?
You have to help me with the question again by rephrasing it.
Okay, so I'm just thinking that if we go back to Brecht, his in talking of strategies of estrangement, it is a strategy towards looking at the world differently in order to act upon that world and act within that world differently.
Yes.
Now, with the examples you're looking at, is there a kind of larger point that you could make or want to make about kind of politics?
Well, for instance, the question that architecture, there is a politics of architecture, which is something that seems to be largely evacuated from architectural discourse in the moment, where the political notion of architecture, the question that architecture has a capacity to define qualities of public space in the sense that it is possible to do something, for instance, like dancing, or it's impossible to do something there. And the question that architecture could understand itself as a medium of or as a catalyst of social production, rather than sort of inviting appropriation of those spaces, rather than excluding those. And I think that the problem that I have with the regime of smoothness that we're in now, right, is the fact that it does not conceive of, or it cannot manage contradiction, as it is always produced in the process of an appropriation of a building, for instance, right? If I see, for instance, Zaha Hadid's Fano Science Center in Wolfsburg, the building works fairly well until it's empty. I mean, so prior to its being taken in possession, it's probably good, and it's exciting. But the minute that this science show comes into it, the entire allure implodes in a rather drastic way, because it's not able to actually to accommodate difference. It would being so obsessed with developing everything in one formal language, it would include that the Coke machine is designed the same way, but as the Coke machine isn't, the Coke machine appears as a nuisance, If you love that kind of architecture, you have to throw the Coke machine out and redesign it. And I have the feeling that it's kind of a tough job for an architect to redesign the world as an entirety. And it would be more, I think, more economical and more interesting also to understand of architecture not as a finite condition, even if you actually finish the building, but understand that it's as finished a condition as a stage in a theater is, which means it works, but it is meaningless until you take it. And that moment, for me, it's an interesting moment if architecture manages to host a play by society that is performed by each of us. And that does not give me the feeling, as a member of that society, to be the unannounced intruder, right? Who spoils the party? Because I haven't been scripted, I basically have the feeling I'm not scripted, and it makes me wonder, whether this can go on, whether this is a sustainable condition. And so that there's the entire idea of scripting architecture in the moment, I think, has the stopping problem that we knew from animation in the 80s or like early 90s. The question, when do you stop actually the animation? And say, okay, this is the space now. I stop here where the wall just tumbles this way, and I don't wait until it goes this way. I say, this is looking cooler. I stop here. And now we have the same problem as a stopping problem, not in time, but in space. Where does design end? And I'm afraid that it's neither possible nor desirable to have a world that is 100% designed. So the architecture, as any kind of discipline of design, I think, needs to understand itself as a co-production of things that you can plan and others that you cannot plan. Yeah. And out of the encounter of the two arises something that I would call the poetry of space.
Thanks very much.
Yes. There's a question here.
Thank you very much for a very interesting example. I have a question about the terminology. You hardly use the term uncanny. Is there anything in particular that you try to make distinction between these two terms? Because,
yes.
I mean, uncanny and estrangement, because
yes.
I think there are some similarity. And
yeah, I would say so. Uncanny comes from Freud's psychoanalysis theory, right? Widler borrowed this term, which is called das Unheimliche, the non-homely, if you would, the unhomely, if you would translate it literally. And it has a different connotation than the concept of estrangement that was invented almost, more or less in the same historical period by Brecht. There are certain connections, but for me the term is also a little bit too connotated in Anthony Widler's way. He used this space really in the sense of spaces that have something gloomy, something, a certain type of suspense that you can't resolve, but it does not. It's for me the term, as he used it, has only this moment of destabilization of your expectations, which is something that estrangement has also, as I explained. But the cool thing about Brecht, in my mind, is that he goes beyond this moment of just saying, "Ooh, this is different than I thought." It's going beyond that point in so far as Brecht tries to make you aware that, okay, because it's different than I thought, it may have totally different possibilities for me to use, right? So the ultimate interest in Brecht's V-effect theory is not to present you with things that look different than you would expect. He makes these kind of contradictions consciously to put you in a position where you flirt with the possibility of another reality and where you actually go for it. Finally, Brecht, what he wants to do is to invite you to a world revolution. Really, it's a political project. Right? And that is not the uncanny. The uncanny is, in Freud's sense, is really the understanding, the coming to terms with the fact that the notion of the self and the ego, they are not as simple, carved as we would think. There are multiple identities that I may have to negotiate every day. So it has a more introverted psychological underpinning, that term for me. And estrangement for me is a more extroverted movement or a questioning of my mental attitudes in the interest to make me aware that I can act differently than I would normally do based on my social routines. That's why I don't use uncanny, even though it's a beautiful term in its own right, but I would apply it to different kinds of things. There's a question in the back. Terrorist or theorist?
No, terrorist.
Terrorist, okay, good.
Fascist.
Okay, good. Mm-hmm.
That stops you so much from being yourself.
Okay.
That you have to react.
Aha, okay, as a kind of counter-reaction against this kind of imposed notion of power. Interesting question. Let me think for a second or two. I think yes. There's a good example. I would advise you to see a movie called Rollerball, a 1970s movie, hardly seen these days, but I think if you go to a good video store, you will find it. It is an amazingly beautiful film because it shows not a fascist architecture or so, but it shows more a totalitarian notion of design in the sense that we've been speaking about before, a design that knows no end, right? That tries to inflict everything. in which, so it's kind of a 1970s smooth space world that is shown, actually very beautiful. And all the interior spaces are amazingly beautiful. And they're always, like in James Bond, always used by the bad guys, right? The most beautiful architecture is generally, most of the times, used by the bad guys. You can even see it now in the, no, actually in the, goes too far, but don't want to discuss projects by living architects. But, and that when you see the movie, at some moment it's suffocating. You really feel that the fact that every space is being taken care of in a sense that there is no, you know, what in Baroque times would be called the white parts of the map, where people said, okay, we know that there's something there below the equator, which later on will be called Latin America, but we don't know exactly how it really looks. You know, what will become Chile is kind of unknown, and but the fact that they know that it is there because some people have been there and spoke about it before they died, makes you wanting to go there. And in this film, the world is shown as a place where these white parts on the map don't exist, and it's hard to describe, but it makes you, it lets you desire some kind of a nothingness where something is not already taken care of. And if we see that movie today, we cannot help correlating it with the notion of a surveillance that has become total, right? And obviously surveillance has become total, and there is no way of escaping. That's why these girls here are so mature in a way, right? Because they don't worry about the fact that they can be seen from the visitors of the museum behind, but they cannot see them. They don't care. You know, I'm visible anyway, right? That's why also probably people put everything on Facebook because they understand. Even if I keep it secretly, if somebody wants to know, they will. And so I think in that sense, it is possible to make. I mean, it's a historic example that this film shows that this psychological counter-reaction can be produced. I don't think I know a historic project where an architect chose that strategy consciously to, for instance, you know, for instance, in a democratic society, produce an architecture that feels suffocating in order to make people revolt against it. But I think it's a very interesting premise. I have to think about that more. Now, before we get totally exhausted, I just wanted to let you know that there's this little reception in the bookstore if you want to join, because it's about this book that you can buy there if you want, today at a unique special student discount, and tomorrow no longer. And it is interesting in the way that it's not directly related to the talk, but it is related in the sense that the projects that I've shown deal with the possibility of architecture of transforming the world by first transforming our vision, the way in which we look at this world, right? There's these two possible things. We can really transform the world physically by doing everything else. You know, the tabula rasa dream of modernism didn't turn out that well, as you know. And there's the other way of making us first look differently at the world and then maybe decide in a second moment what is good and what is bad and what we could do differently. And this book is basically dedicated to the transformative condition of the city that we live in today, a global city that is manifold, that is not, that can't be pinned down. So we studied with 50 people, different conditions of cities worldwide on 5 continents. And it's both architects, theorists, artists, politicians who speak about something that we subsumed under the headline, tell me what is urban for you and I tell you who you are, right? In order to say that any urban condition now is a specific condition that is not, that can't be generalized upon each other, on other urban conditions. And it's, Yeah, it was a product of development further on from a congress in Shanghai that we partly coordinated, and the book takes the best of it and then more things that we thought should be in it. Yeah, it's 400 pages. You can find it downstairs, and it's 37 pounds as opposed to 43 for you only now. So if you want to join me downstairs, I can show you a bit more. You can have a look and peek and thumb through the book. And the tactile notion, again, to let you only know that much, is highly necessary with that book. Thanks a lot.